This week we'll continue to review a very interesting statement made by Pilgrim. Put simply, be very careful about feeling sorry for yourself. Self-pity is a dangerous proposition. She recommends that when we have a problem, when some kind of challenge arises for us, that we observe it, that we cast it, that we frame it as a spiritual opportunity. A spiritual opportunity. Just this very simple act, just this very simple act of reframing, of recasting experience that is challenging as an opportunity, as a spiritual opportunity, this can cause a deep shift in our lives. A deep change in the way we see ourselves and the world. And in the way she talks about it, in the way that she describes it, that's a shift that leads to peace. It leads to peace within, and it leads to peace in the world. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about why I think that that is true. To shift a little bit into a Buddhist way of looking at things, our minds, our conceptions are set up to create three outcomes. And these three outcomes, I think, are important to understand in a philosophical sense. It's conceptual, but it's worth thinking about very carefully. And I'm going to shift them just a bit. I'm going to slightly interpret them to simplify matters because it's actually very subtle. These are some of the fundamental forces in the human mind until we're enlightened. And so naturally there's some subtlety in this, but to simplify it just a bit, our way of understanding, our way of living, a way of perceiving, and our way of behaving is basically set up to bring forth the following three outcomes. Number one, sensual pleasure. We want to maximize sensual pleasure. We want to have as much sensual pleasure as possible. And if you look at the general course of human history, you see that this is something that we take very seriously. We hear population who would be at a Sunday evening mindfulness group in Burlington, Vermont. We, in general, are people who experience enormous amounts of sensual pleasure and very little sensual discomfort compared to the average person alive today, compared to the average person in the course of human history, and in comparison to the average living thing. When we experience discomfort, we think that the solution is to get rid of that discomfort and to replace it with sensual pleasure, with physical comfort. So we have all kinds of good food to eat, and we have nice warm showers, and lots of heating. And because that isn't enough, we also have audio, video resources so that we can listen to and look at whatever we want as much as possible. And we take that sensual pleasure to be extremely important. So we want sensual pleasure. Okay, very good. Another thing that we want is survival. We want to survive. We want to exist. We want to perpetuate ourselves into the future. And then the third is that we want destruction. We want to be destroyed. We want to be eliminated. We want to no longer exist. So these 3 points are what we maximize. The third I'm going to set aside a little bit. Although I think each of us can look at our own lives and see occasions when we've tried to destroy ourselves, when self-destruction became very important to us. But for now, I'd like to talk about the second more, which is a sense of survival. Now, in the Sanskrit, the word is just existence. It's just existing. I change that a little bit to surviving. But we can ask, what is it that we perceive survives? What do we think survives? What is it that we're trying to protect from not existing? That very thing is whatever we think we're going to destroy. But for now, emphasizing the existence, what is it that exists? What is it that survives? What is it that we're trying to perpetuate? What is it that we want to exist? This point is worth looking at very closely. And much of Buddhism simply asks us to look at that question very closely. We want to survive. Okay, what is it that we want to survive? What is supposed to survive? What is it? And the answer, of course, is easy to say. The answer is very easy to say. You can say it in one syllable. Self. Self is what we want to make sure survives. I want to survive. That's what. What are you talking about? This is an easy question. Why is this tradition going on for thousands of years about such an easy question? You just answer the question. Well, I want to survive. That's what. Simple as that. What's the big deal? The big deal is that we can look at that and ask a few questions. One is, well, okay, let's say you have the choice between existence of yourself and existence of happiness. Which would you choose? Well, the answer is simple. Self. I'd rather have myself survive miserably, myself, and have there be only happiness remaining. Clearly, I should survive. Happiness should not. Well, okay, what about truth? What about truth? If your sense of self had to pass away in order for the truth to be manifest, to be perpetuated, to be realized, what would you choose? Well, self, definitely. What are you talking about? Okay, what about love? Love is good as long as I have it. But it's essential that I have it, so I need to survive. I'm prior. I have the priority over these various things. So this is a very interesting strategy, and the point that I made last week that I'll emphasize a bit more this week is that when we have a belief, when we believe in something, and in particular when our sense of self depends on that belief, then not only do we hold that belief no matter what happens, but actually when evidence emerges that doesn't confirm that belief, that we believe something and then there's evidence that disproves that belief, assuming of course it's a belief that we hold dear, assuming it's a belief that is connected to our sense of self, then I'll just quiz you from last week. What typically happens? You believe in something, then there's evidence that shows that that is not true. After that happens, do you believe in that more or less? More, certainly more. Definitely more. And there's plenty of evidence for this. Last week I talked a little bit about religions. We know of some studies about religious folks who they say there's an interesting study of people who considered, well, there are different people. Some people considered Jesus to be the Son of God. Other people didn't. And then there was a false report given to them that it had been shown conclusively that the Bible is false, that all the stuff in the Bible about how Jesus is the Son of God was made up. So the people who didn't think that Jesus was the Son of God said, oh, good. Well, see, I'm right. After all, it's true. Now we know. And so they became very clear in their belief, so that's good. Okay. Certain people said, well, I don't believe it. I don't believe this study. So they just remained constant in their belief. What's very interesting are the people who believed that Jesus was the Son of God before this false report was given to them, who accepted that it's true. The report is actually true. The Bible is totally made up, but I accept this report as true. Those people believed, as a result of that, even more firmly that Jesus is the Son of God. Isn't that interesting? Now, you'd think that the other two make a certain amount of sense, but this one, the group of people whose belief was the most polarized, became the most extreme, were those who accepted the validity of the evidence that was contrary to their view. So accepting the validity of evidence that's contrary to our view makes us firmer in that very view that the evidence doesn't support. Now, this is interesting. And you might think, well, it's just all those religious people, isn't it? Scientific-minded people aren't like this. You might think that. But if you think that, then that fact that you think that is actually, it's self-evidence that it's not true. The fact that we tend to believe that is itself what you call confirmation bias, because we all tend to believe that science is super and the solution to our problems. There was another study which I actually find even more interesting, which is that a group of scientists, PhDs in relevant fields connected to physics, were given a formula, a clear formula for determining the volume of a sphere, of a ball. Okay, so there's a ball, and here's a formula, and with this formula, you can determine the volume of it. They said, okay, they learned the formula, happy, happy. And then they were asked to calculate, here's this ball, here's a sphere, please calculate the volume, and they did. And they said, okay, good. So now what we'd like to do is actually pour water into it. Here's a cup measure. Pour water into it. You just did a measurement. Now you know how many cups of water are in this. Yes. So now pour cups of water into it. And they did. And they found that the number of cups of water they poured in was different from what was predicted by the formula. Yes? Okay, so now you figure this out. Did the scientists become more convinced in the validity of the formula or less convinced as a result of hands-on evidence absolutely proving that the formula was wrong?
I would hope so. I would hope that there would be proof that would prove their theory wrong.
No,
the formula wrong.
Absolutely every one of them became more set in the belief that this formula is true. Now we know it's true. We just don't know why. There's something wrong with the cup or with the water or with physics. But the formula is true because again, it has to do with a sense of self. They're scientists. They have to believe in formulas. It's their identity. Which is just fascinating. These are PhDs, but the results are actually more extreme than in the other studies that I referred to with the religious people who we like to criticize. Just an amazing phenomenon. When it's interesting. An interesting scientist, some of you may have heard of Max Planck. You may have heard of him, very interesting scientist whose specialty, I guess, is in psychology because of his, he's actually a physicist, but maybe his specialty is actually in psychology because of a comment he made about science. He said, a new scientific theory does not spread by winning over its opponents, meaning the scientists who disagree with it. It spreads because its opponents eventually die. That's how it works. That's how scientific progress happens. Scientists die. That's how we gradually make progress in science and in so many other fields. So we have to ask a reasonable question. Why would it be that when there's clear evidence in a certain direction, we hold even more strongly to a certain belief? Well, if you look at it from a certain perspective, the reason is that we value our sense of self over the truth. The truth is less important to us than our sense of self. Therefore, especially when there's evidence against something that constitutes our sense of self, especially then we have to hold our self-view. That's the time when it's most important in order to activate a kind of a defense mechanism and to protect ourselves against the truth. And it's interesting how fundamental this is. This happens to us all the time. It's a very consistent psychological phenomena. We, again and again, go through the process of discovering something and then determining that we can't trust it, that it's wrong for some reason. But under those circumstances, when we fail at all that, then we just have to hold on as tight as we can to a certain belief. I bring it up in particular because it isn't just truth that we value at a lower priority than our continued sense of self. If you imagine the scientists, to doubt formulas is actually to doubt oneself. And that is perceived deeply as very dangerous. And to accept that doubt as valid could be seen as suicidal. And I think that our minds respond in that very intense way because we're trying to survive. And that sense of survival is held most dear. But what about something like happiness? Would be very good if we could value happiness above our sense of self. But let me ask you a question. Let's say that you're doing this practice. Let's say that you're doing this practice and you do it for some period of time. And gradually, as you do it, your sense of happiness increases. And your sense of self, your personal storyline, the way you identify, I'm the sort of person who does this. Those people did that to me, which is why I'm like this. All of the stories that we hold about ourselves, the things that we hold very dear. This is really who I am. This is how I came to be who I am. And this is the self that I have. What would happen if we were put in a position due to the practice that started to fall apart, that started to be seen as stories, as delusions, fabrications. And rather than those stories, we began to experience a sense of peace and happiness. Given everything we've discussed so far, what do you think a person would do at that moment? It would conclude that the practice isn't working and that you have to get as far away from it as possible in order to hold as tightly as possible onto a sense of self. And that is, in fact, what we find. I'd say that it's relatively, it's a startling thing to say, but it's actually relatively easy to get enlightened. It's relatively easy to go beyond our sense of self and to awaken to something beyond ourselves. So why don't we? The reason is that we try so hard not to. And at those times when our sense of self is being threatened by the practice, which I'd like to say is exactly what the practice does. It's what it's designed to do. At those times when our sense of self is being threatened, at those times, those are the very times, those are the times when when one of two things is about to happen. We're either going to have a major breakthrough and experience a new and deeper, truer kind of happiness, or we're going to do whatever we have to do to get away from this practice. Whatever that would be, and there are incredibly diverse creative solutions to the problem of how do I get away from this practice. But it's something that, again, I as a teacher's practice in myself and in students see all the time. It's at that moment when we realize, oh, I have so many other important things to do. Oh, this practice isn't working for me. oh, this isn't going to really give me what I want after all. Oh, maybe I'll just help this other area of my life first. I need to heal. I need to do this other thing. I need to help those people. I need to whatever. It's at those times when we realize we have to get away from the practice. It's exactly at that moment. And so I bring it up so that we might at least be somewhat aware of the possibility that as we find ourselves coming up with reasons that we have to stop doing the practice, we might consider, maybe I'm like that scientist who's coming up with reasons that this formula is actually accurate. It must be accurate. I know it's accurate. My sense of self must be true, important, essential, whatever it is. We should question that. We should consider it. We should attempt to look at ourselves in that way, just as a possibility, that that may be what's happening. So let's say that what I just said made sense and works in your mind, at least conceptually. And we acknowledge that, yes, maybe when I'm coming up with the reasons that I should stop the training, coming up with reasons that I shouldn't do the practice, maybe what I'm doing is avoiding a breakthrough, avoiding an escape from my sense of self and the suffering that comes with that, the story that I'm telling. Maybe I'm defending that fabrication because, again, to not defend it feels like suicide. It feels very dangerous to do the practice. But it doesn't make any sense that it's dangerous. You're just sitting there following your breath. It doesn't make sense it's dangerous, so we come up with some other excuse. Maybe I've gotten that across, that a very deep defense mechanism, a very deep sense of desire to survive, of fear, is emerging and is motivating our cogitation, our understanding, our way of looking at things. Maybe that's come through. Okay, so what do you do about it? Well, this brings us back to Peace Pilgrim's quote. Because there's a relatively simple test that turns out to be incredibly accurate for whether we're avoiding the practice in order to defend our sense of self. It's an easy test, although I have to say that once I tell it to you, it becomes easy for your mind to make it complicated, but I'm going to give it a shot. The test is, are you feeling sorry for yourself? Do you tend to have the thought, oh, the past month has been really hard. Oh, it's so hard for me. I've been trying to practice, but it's not giving me what I want. It's so hard. I would do these things that I know are good, but I'm tired because things are so hard. Oh, I should have had a breakthrough by now, but it's so sad I didn't. Whenever there are these thoughts of self-pity, the casting of ourselves in a pitiful position, the framing of ourselves as something pathetic, that deserves more, that isn't getting what I really need or deserve, that's an extremely useful clue. That what we're doing is defending our sense of self rather than doing the practice. Because if we're doing the practice, then everything is a spiritual opportunity. Everything. There is never a cause to feel sorry for ourselves. Never a cause for self-pity. That doesn't arise. If it arises, then we've cast ourselves in the victim position. And the good news is that once we've cast ourselves as a victim, once we've self-identified as a victim, anything goes. That's what's so great about the victim identification. That then nothing applies to me anymore. I'm a victim. I have to take care of myself. Whatever that means. But the most, I just have to take care of myself. Whatever that is. And so then we aren't the responsible party anymore. We're not the person with the opportunity. We're the depraved person who, and for whom anything goes. Because of that, we can't be trusted, and we know that. And because of that, we're injecting spiritual poison into our hearts. As Peace Pilgrim said, to feel sorry for yourself is deadly in a spiritual sense. It's deadly. It's lethal. It's poisonous. It's toxic. Any sense of self-pity. And there's one piece of good news, and again, you can avoid this if you want, but it's really easy for us to cast ourselves as someone. We can be saying, oh, I've been having such a hard time, but I don't feel sorry for myself. We can come up with a storyline around the storyline, but good news, we know other people, and we can ask other people if we look like we're feeling sorry for ourselves. Does it look to you as if I'm feeling sorry for myself? If so, that's still a very useful clue. It isn't that things aren't hard. Peace Pilgrim isn't saying that there are no challenges. That's not what she's saying. She didn't say there are no challenges. You look in the book. He said, on the contrary, challenges are spiritual opportunities. That's the shift. It's that the challenge doesn't become a challenge in terms of how to survive. The challenge doesn't become a challenge in terms of how to feel better, in terms of how to feel more comfortable. And the challenge isn't a challenge in terms of how to destroy myself. The challenge is spiritual awakening, is to use this opportunity to go beyond ourselves, to become free from ourselves. Becoming free from ourselves doesn't mean destroying ourselves, and it certainly doesn't mean defending ourselves. It means going beyond ourselves. And each challenge is not she's saying there are no challenges. There are challenges, but each challenge is interpreted, is understood, is perceived as the opportunity to go beyond ourselves. The opportunity to see through ourselves. The opportunity to drop whatever it is about ourselves that we're defending. So that we can see, clearly see, actually see an essential shift. And that essential shift is not I need to destroy myself, not I need to get rid of myself in order to awaken, but seeing into the nature of self, and to see that the nature of self is non-self. The nature of self is non-self. All of us, we come together as a result of conditions, not as a result of some kind of self-existence, as a result of relationships. And then we come apart naturally. All of that's natural. To directly perceive that is the opportunity given to us when we have a challenge. And to run away from that spiritual opportunity by feeling sorry for ourselves, that's the deadly poison that Peace Pilgrim is talking about. And it's not only a deadly poison in terms of our own hearts, but it's actually the deadly poison for the world. Because the more power we have, the more we tend to use that power to avoid growth. And the human tendency to avoid growth is the source of war and environmental destruction. So our own tendency to avoid growth and instead favor sensual pleasure, survival, and self-destruction, that's the basis of the elimination of life as we know it on this planet, which is happening. And we're the cause of it. Our own minds are the cause of it. So what do we do? What's the radical step? What's the revolutionary move? It is to take every challenge as a spiritual opportunity. Take a moment to straighten up and settle in. And bring your attention to your breathing. And if you're paying attention to your breathing, if your attention is directly on your breathing, then at that moment, your attention isn't on any particular belief, any particular story, any particular sense of self. And so we've confirmed that we're not holding on to those things. In that case, simply continue to be aware of your breathing as a direct experience. If you have any difficulty paying attention to your breathing, if any distraction arises, any story, any thought, any idea, any distraction at all, arises and poses an obstacle, a challenge to paying attention to the experience of breathing in this moment, then intentionally frame that challenge as a spiritual opportunity, as an opportunity to deepen your practice. If there happens to be something that you're very fixated on, I really need to think about this right now. I really have to hold on to this perspective or opinion or story. And that's a wonderful opportunity. You can count yourself as one of the lucky ones. It's such an extraordinary opportunity this evening. Make use of it. And if you don't have any distractions at all, staying with your breath without any wavering, that's a wonderful opportunity. You can count yourself as one of the lucky ones. Stay with your breathing. And if you're anywhere in between, it's a wonderful opportunity. You can count yourself as one of the lucky ones. Take advantage of it. Deepen your practice by taking advantage of this opportunity. But in any case, don't turn away from the practice. Whatever it is that most compels you to turn away from the practice, therein lies your greatest opportunity for cutting through sense of self. The opportunity is very simple. Focus on your breath. If you're focusing on your breath, then you have, for the purpose of this exercise, set aside your story, your sense of self, experiencing this moment, this experience of breathing. If there's anything at all that pulls you away from that comes into your mind in order to distract you, then that's a challenge. It's an opportunity. Make use of it. Interpret it that way. This is a challenge. It's an opportunity. Now is the time to take advantage of it. Whatever it is that arises that's challenging, that's the opportunity. If you'd like, feel free to move a little bit, taking this as the next challenge, the next opportunity. How to continue to focus while moving. You can continue to move or return to a seated position, but whatever you're doing, continue to focus. And if there's any difficulty with that, receive that as a challenge. Continue with just the same attitude. And if you'd like, you can play with this a little bit. You can actually invite in the distractions. All right, distractions, come along. Give me opportunities to practice. Welcome them. Cultivate a sense of excitement about the challenges of practicing, the difficulties, perhaps emotional, perhaps mental, perhaps physical, whatever might distract you from your breath. Invite it, because you know that it's an opportunity. As you do this practice, you may occasionally notice the experience of not wanting to take the opportunity, because if you did, you would succeed. Not wanting to cut through a pattern that causes us suffering. Because if we were to try that, we would do it. Not wanting to become free from a toxic view of self, because if we were to become free from a toxic view of self, then we would be free from a toxic view of self. You may notice that. That is a great opportunity. A fear of health and happiness. The fear of honesty. Notice that very, very closely. No need to try to get rid of it. Become familiar with it. That is an opportunity. If it arises, not forcing anything, but if it arises, take advantage of the opportunity to explore the tightness that arises when truth and happiness threaten our sense of self. Explore that tightness, that resistance, if it emerges. No need to force it. The technique is simple. What we're doing is simple. We're attending to our breathing. Any challenge that arises, we interpret it as a spiritual opportunity. But if this particular opportunity arises, the tightness and resistance that comes with proximity to honesty, freedom, and happiness, then examine that tightness as its own kind of opportunity. And if you'd like, just for fun, to finish, you can invite in the stories about yourself that we hold most deeply and that are most damaging. Invite them in. Yes, those stories, the deeply held, problematic ones, come up and join me in this practice. Because right there in those stories is an enormous spiritual opportunity. Don't even try to figure out what that opportunity is. Just hold that conviction. Hold that story. The story that these fixed, problematic stories are spiritual opportunities. It's a challenge, but in working through it, enormous growth will emerge. If you'd like to play with that for the last few minutes, please feel free. So this is a time for questions, anything at all.
Really surprised at how quickly the damaging story came up when you asked us to invite them in. Like, I spent all this time thinking, I don't know what it is. What could it be? What is it? I was like, oh yeah.
And did you interpret it appropriately?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a challenge. Challenge is to see it as a challenge is to see a challenge as an opportunity.
Something very similar happened for me, and phrase wheel of samsara, which I never totally understood. I've interpreted it before. It's like just a cycle of suffering that doesn't end until it's noticed, and then I just